currently on the planet? On August 4th in 1753, our nation's first president, George Washington, becomes a master mason. At the time of young George Washington's formal induction, he was a Virginia planter. He became a master mason, the highest basic rank in the secret fraternity of Freemasonry. The ceremony was held at the Masonic Lodge No. 4 in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Washington was 21 years old and would soon command his first military operation as a major in the Virginia Colonial Militia. Freemasonry evolved from the practices and rituals of the stonemasons' guilds in the Middle Ages. With the decline of European cathedral building, lodges decided to admit non-stonemasons to maintain membership, and the secret fraternal order grew in popularity in Europe. In 1717, the first Grand Lodge, an association of lodges, was founded in England, and Freemasonry was soon disseminated throughout the British Empire. The first American Mason Lodge was established in Philadelphia in 1730, and future revolutionary leader Benjamin Franklin was a founding member. There is no central Masonic authority, and Freemasons are governed locally by the order's many customs and rites. Members trace the origins of Masonry back to the erecting of King Solomon's Temple in biblical times and are expected to believe in the Supreme Being, follow specific religious rites, and maintain a vow of secrecy concerning the order's ceremonies. The Masons of the 18th century adhered to liberal democratic principles that included religious toleration, loyalty to local government, and the importance of charity. From its inception, Freemasonry encountered considerable opposition from organized religion, especially from the Roman Catholic Church. For George Washington, joining the Masons was a rite of passage and an expression of its civic responsibility. After becoming a Master Mason, Washington had the option of passing through a series of additional rites that would take him to higher degrees. In 1788, shortly before becoming the first president of our country, Washington was elected the first worshipful master of Alexandria Lodge No. 22. Many other leaders of the American Revolution, including Paul Revere, John Hancock, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the Boston Tea Party saboteurs, were also Freemasons, and Masonic rites were witnessed at such events as Washington's presidential inauguration and the laying of the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., a city supposedly designed with Masonic symbols in mind. Masonic symbols approved by Washington in the design of the Great Seal of the United States can be seen on the $1 bill. The all-seeing eye above an unfinished pyramid is unmistakably Masonic, and the scroll beneath, which proclaims the advent of a new secular order in Latin, is one of Freemasonry's long-standing goals. The Great Seal appeared on the $1 bill during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, our 32nd president, and also a Mason. Freemasonry has continued to be important in U.S. politics, and at least 15 presidents, 5 Supreme Court Chief Justices, and numerous members of Congress have been Masons. Presidents known to be Masons include our first president, George Washington, of course, James Monroe, our fifth president, Andrew Jackson, our nation's seventh president, James K. Polk, our nation's 11th president, James Buchanan, our nation's 15th president, Andrew Johnson, our nation's 17th president, James Garfield, our nation's 20th president, William McKinley, our nation's 25th president, Theodore Roosevelt, our nation's 26th president, William Howard Taft, our nation's 27th president, Warren G. Harding, our nation's 29th president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, our nation's 32nd president, Harry S. Truman, our nation's 33rd president, Lyndon B. Johnson, our nation's 36th president, Gerald R. Ford, our nation's 38th president. Today, there are an estimated 2 million Masons in the United States. On August 4th in 1942, the United States and Mexico signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement, creating what is known as the Bracero Program. The program, which lasted until 1964, was the largest guest worker program in U.S. history. Throughout its existence, the Bracero program benefited both farmers and laborers, but also gave rise to numerous labor disputes, abuses of workers, and other problems that have long characterized the history of farm labor in the southwestern United States. The program was born from necessity, as the federal government worried that American entry into World War II would sap the Southwest of much of its farm labor. Manual laborers, braceros in Spanish, from Mexico became an important part of the region's economy, and the program outlasted the war. The program guaranteed workers a number of basic protections, including a minimum wage, insurance, and safe, free housing. However, farm owners frequently failed to live up to these requirements. Housing and food routinely proved to be well below standards, and wages were not only low, but also frequently paid late or not at all. Years after the program ended, many braceros were still fighting to receive the money that had been deducted from their salaries and allegedly put into savings accounts. Due to these broken promises, strikes were a common occurrence throughout this period. Over 4.6 million contracts were issued over the 22 years of the Bracero program. Though Congress let the program expire in 1964, it set the stage for decades of labor disputes and a dynamic of migrant labor that still exists today. The 60s and 70s saw the rise of the United Farm Workers, a union composed largely of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, which continued fighting many of the same inequalities that face the braceros. To this day, migrant labor from Mexico continues to be a vital part of Southwestern economy, as well as a source of political and racial tension. It was on August 4th in 1944 that beautiful little girl that we all read about in grade school, if you grew up in America at least, Anne Frank, was captured. Acting on a tip from a Dutch informer, the Nazi Gestapo captured 15-year-old Jewish diarist Anne Frank and her family in a sealed-off area of an Amsterdam warehouse. The Franks had taken shelter there in 1942 out of fear of deportation to a Nazi concentration camp. They occupied the small space with another Jewish family and a single Jewish man, and were aided by Christian friends who bought them food and supplies. Anne spent much of her time in the so-called secret annex, working on her diary. The diary survived the war, overlooked by the Gestapo that discovered the hiding place. but Anne and nearly all of the others continued their eternity in the Nazi concentration camps. Annelies Marie Frank was born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, on June 12th in 1929. She was the second daughter of Otto Frank and Edith Frank Hollander, both of Jewish families that lived in Germany for centuries. With the rise of Nazi leader Adolf Hitler in 1933, Otto moved his family to Amsterdam to escape the escalating Nazi persecution of Jews. In Holland, he ran a successful spice and jam business and attended a Montessori school with other middle-class Dutch children. But with the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940, she was forced to transfer to a Jewish school. In 1942, Otto began arranging a hiding place in an annex of his warehouse on the Prinsengracht Canal in Amsterdam. On her 13th birthday in 1942, Anne began a diary relating her everyday experiences, her relationship with her family and friends, and observations about the increasingly dangerous world around her. Less than a month later, Anne's older sister, Margot, received a call-up notice to report to a Nazi work camp. Fearing deportation to a Nazi concentration camp, the Frank family took shelter in the secret annex the next day. 1 week later, they were joined by Otto Frank's business partner and his family. In November, a Jewish dentist, the eighth occupant of the hiding place, joined the group. For 2 years, Anne kept a diary about her life in hiding that is marked with poignancy, humor, and insight. The entrance to the secret annex was hidden by a hinged bookcase, and former employees of Otto and other Dutch friends delivered them food and supplies procured at high risk. Anne and the others lived in rooms with blacked-out windows and never flushed the toilet during the day out of fear that their presence would be detected. In June 1944, Anne's spirits were raised by the Allied landings at Normandy, and she was hopeful that the long-awaited liberation of Holland would soon begin. On August 1st in 1944, Anne made her last entry in her diary. 3 days later, 25 months of seclusion ended with the arrival of the Nazi Gestapo. Anne and the others had been given away by an unknown informer, and they were arrested along with 2 of the Christians who had helped shelter them. They were sent to a concentration camp in Holland, and in September, Anne and most of the others were shipped to the Auschwitz death camp in Poland. In the fall of 1944, with the Soviet liberation of Poland underway, Anne was moved with her sister Margot to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Suffering under the deplorable conditions of the camp, the 2 sisters caught typhus and continued their eternity in February of 1945. The camp was liberated by the British less than 2 months later. Otto Frank was the only one of the 10 to physically survive the Nazi death camps. After the war, he returned to Amsterdam via Russia and was reunited with Miep Gies, one of his former employees who had helped shelter him. She handed him Anne's diary, which she had found undisturbed after the Nazi raid. In 1947, Anne's diary was published by Otto in its original Dutch. An instant bestseller and eventually translated into more than 70 languages, the Diary of Anne Frank has served as a literary testament to the nearly 6 million Jews, including Anne herself, who continued their eternity in the Holocaust. The Frank family's hideaway at Prinsengracht 263 in Amsterdam opened as a museum in 1960. A new English translation of Anne's diary in 1995 restored material that had been edited out of the original version, making the work nearly a third longer. All historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.